Hello everyone. So today we're going to be talking a lot about quantitative and qualitative research, and within that is going to include a study and a look and evaluation of different research methods used in psychological research. To start us off today, we're going to be watching this video on why we hug so hard it hurts. Um, So we're going to start the video, and what I want you guys to do is during the video, I want you guys to write down whether you think this is a valid form of research, right? Think about, what are the strengths of this research? What are the limitations of doing this type of research or the study itself? Does this actually study cute aggression? And if you don't know what cute aggression it is right there in the title. Why we hug so hard it hurts. It's this idea of like when your aunt comes and pinches you on the cheek because she loves you so much, or when you see a dog um, and you just love it so much and you just want to hug it very, very hard. Um, so that is what we're going to be looking at here within this video. So on your own copy of the PowerPoint, I want you to watch the video, and then I want you to write down whether this is a valid form of research. So I'll pause the video right here and allow you to do that. So after looking at the video, really the two main types of research we're going to be talking about, and this is pretty common across all of science, is either qualitative or non-numerical data. This could include things like surveys, case studies, observations, anything that is non-numerical, and quantitative data, numerical. And if you want to just remember the difference between the two, quantity, numerical, qualitative, quality, deeper from words. So starting off with qualitative research, again, this is non-numerical data used to gain an insight into psychological phenomena of interest. Um, Now, this allows the researcher to really go beyond just the shallowness or the one-dimensional nature of a number and go more in depth with the subject themselves. If you're talking to someone for 20 minutes, you're probably getting a better contextual idea of what is going on with them, as opposed to just sort of jotting down a number from a measure that may or may not be valid. Now, oftentimes, psychological researchers will include numerical data as well, um, and may include some quantitative uh, data. And this is called a mixed methods research. I would say that this is more common than, um, or often more common than just a straight up qualitative research study. Oftentimes to do things like triangulation, which we've talked about or will talk about in another video, you need to have different sources of information, and so that becomes very, very important. So the three types of qualitative research we're going to talk about today are case studies, naturalistic observations, and interviews. Starting off with case studies, this is a detailed analysis over time of an area of interest or a case to produce context-dependent knowledge. So this could be an in-depth study of an individual, a small community, um, something like that. A case study is usually just referring to one context overall. And one example of this that we're going to be talking about a lot is this example of HM, or Scoville, Milner, and Corkin, who were the researchers in this study. So HM was a gentleman who had these terrible seizures. And so what they did and what they decided to do was they decided to take out a piece of his brain in order to help stop the seizures. Well, what happened when that occurred is that HM ended up losing quite a bit of his memory. And so what this taught the researchers was the role that the hippocampus, the part of the brain that was cut out, plays in creating new memories. Because that was really the issue for him. Could not create some types of new memories. Some other ones he could. And we'll talk about that throughout the year. But really, the case study of HM, who was studied over the course of 50 years with many different studies, with many different types of things, was a case study in nature. Another type of qualitative research method are naturalistic observations. So these are observations of naturally occurring behavior in a natural setting. Obviously, these are prized because you are seeing someone behave in their natural environment. Sometimes lab settings have a limitation that they are artificial, they're not real life, and so people may act differently than they would in a naturalistic environment. And so naturalistic observations are important for those. And in terms of how we record the notes, the data that we get from these, field notes become very important parts of the data, and then observations may be participant or non-participant observations. So what I mean by this, and what this means, is that the researcher could either be a participant within the context of what they are observing, or they may not be a participant. They may just be someone who's sort of disconnected, does not want to, sort of interfere in any way within what is going on in this natural environment. Now, on top of naturalistic observations, there's other types of naturalistic observations called covert observations. And covert, just like any other time where covert is used, this is sort of meaning hidden, not seen, those sorts of things. And so these absolutely need to be justified. If you were doing a psychological study and you're peering through someone's kitchen window at night, this would not be an ethical use of naturalistic observations, and would not be a scientific necessity. The last one we're going to talk about today are interviews. So these are used to gain insight into people's thoughts, opinions, feelings from their own point of view. And there's several different types here. So the first one, unstructured, more like a conversation, no preset questions. This has the limitation that you can sort of end up skewing the data based on how you ask the question, based on where the conversation heads, those sorts of things. The next one are semi-structured. So these are open-ended questions, no set sort of, pre-format. There could be questions where it could take the interview in a whole host of different ways. And then there's group interviews. So these are obviously with different groups of people. These could be followed by surveys, a quantitative method to collect data from a representative sample of this group so that the findings can be then generalized to a larger population. So those are group interviews. The next type of research we're going to talk about here is probably the most pervasive used method, or pervasively used method, and this is quantitative research. So using numerical data in informing your research. So experiments are probably the ones that you're most aware of, familiar with, those sorts of things. And so these are psychological studies that are designed with one clear independent variable and a dependent variable. This doesn't mean that there couldn't be other treatments within the independent variable, right? Like if you're studying hair color, you may have 4 different types of hair color: red, brown, blonde, bald, black hair, whatever. But there's usually one clear independent variable that's being studied. And then you control other factors that could possibly affect the dependent variable. Um, Alternatively, in some of these cases, there may be only two conditions of the independent variable, one being the control, one being the test condition. But like I said before, that is something where you may also have different testing conditions. And the idea of a simple experiment is going to be important to us because we're going to be doing this for the internal assessment later on, where you're going to be replicating an experiment. So that becomes incredibly important to us as we go forward. The next one are field experiments. So this is where the researcher manipulates the independent variable but conducts the experiment in a real-life environment. So as a result, extraneous variables cannot be controlled. And this may skew the results because, like it says there, life is at times uncontrollable. So one example of this that you could think of is if we pulled off a psychological experiment in a school, right? We go into a classroom, we do a psychological experiment, but as we know, there could be a possibility that someone walks in the middle of the experiment. Someone gets pulled out of class in the middle of the experiment. A bell rings in the middle of an experiment. Someone's sick the day of the experiment. All of these sorts of things can skew the results, which may have occurred. The next one are called quasi-experiments. In most experiments, people are randomly assigned to a condition on the independent variable. However, in quasi-experiments, you are sorted into different groups based on characteristics of interest. So a few minutes ago, I talked about, hair color, right? You would be sorted into different areas. And obviously, I would be sorted into the bald category. I'll pause here for a few laughs. All right, now that you've chuckled quite a bit to yourself, other factors that you could look at include gender, ethnicity, scores on a depression scale. So there's no random assignment to groups, and there's a few benefits of this. Time, logistics of experiment, cost, but also external validity, because you are looking specifically at the characteristics they have, and that may make it more generalizable to the public. However, it could be more limited as well, because the randomization is limited. You may be getting people who are answering based on the crowd that they're seeing around them, or they may fit more into the identity that they adhere to. The research must also adhere to ethical standards. And so if you're comparing race, gender, sex, stuff like that, that may be very difficult to adhere to ethical standards. Obviously, if you're doing something like comparing intelligence or comparing brain sizes when talking about race, gender, sex, any sort of characteristic like that, that's fraught with a lot of historical stereotypes, discrimination, prejudice, those sorts of things that may be very, very difficult. And that's why we don't do that in the IA. You will never compare groups of people on the basis of race, gender, sex, socioeconomic class, stuff like that. The next method here are natural experiments. And oftentimes we confuse field experiments with natural experiments, but in a natural experiment, researchers find a naturally occurring variable and end up studying them. So in this, unlike field experiments, the researcher is unable to manipulate the independent variable. That's what IV refers to. So for example, we're going to look at something called attachment. And attachment is the strength of a bond between two people. And usually it's studying parent and child. So you would not manipulate the attachment between a parent and a child, especially a young toddler, because that could have long-ranging effects. And so a natural experiment would fit most nicely into this area. So a few strengths: high ecological validity, less likelihood of characteristics affecting results, used in situations in which ethically unacceptable to manipulate the independent variable. And by ecological validity, going back to the first one here, we're going to refer to the fact that we are using real life environments. And so it's going to be more generalizable as data, and in looking at these different psychological phenomena, that it would be a more valid study because of that. A few limitations: more expensive and time consuming than lab experiments, because you're working in real life, and so like the second one says, there's no control over extraneous variables, and so it may skew your results. You may have to work harder in order to get results that are scientifically verifiable. And then the last one we're going to talk about today is correlational research. And oftentimes this is referred to, while sort of as a less scientific form of research, because you're not seeing an actual causal relationship between two things. Really, you're measuring two variables that are not termed independent and dependent variables, but you're looking for a connection between two things. And like we'll talk about throughout this year, correlation does not necessarily point to causation. Even though two things change at the same time, that does not mean that they cause each other. And two reasons why you would use these is that you do not believe the statistical relationship is a causal one, and then also in times where you can't manipulate the variable because it would be impossible, impractical, unethical. And so correlational research is really used in order to sort of point to the possibility that maybe we need to study this more. And so you'll want to be careful when using correlational research to sort of show a point or explain a point, or at least identify the limitations of using that research, because again, it's not showing a direct cause and effect between two things, but rather a potential relationship between two things. All right, with that being said, thanks for listening to this presentation. If you have any questions on research methods, please, by all means, contact me. All right, have a good day.